Yeah. So at that point, really, the traditional relationship to the land, because of what happened to the land, it was literally taken away from your people.
Mm.
It was. I'm kind of interested in that. I mean, how did that happen?
Well, I don't know exactly how. I do know in 1958 there was a meeting between two priests, a representative from the federal government, and 15 men from the community. And there are multiple stories. Some men say they were going to learn about what enfranchisement means, all kinds of different stories. Ultimately, it meant that there was an enfranchisement and people, some, not all, families were paid to leave the reserve. I think it was $3,000 to leave their homelands. And some moved to St. Albert, some moved to Kikino, some to Alexander, some to Alexis, and some to Onaway, Calahoo, Villeneuve, River Kabar, the smaller surrounding towns. And so, it isn't so much the loss of the land that has really been devastating. It's been the loss of our connection to one another. When I go to other First Nations and spend time, kids are going to their grandparents or their aunts for dinner, or their uncles, or they're riding their bike to their cousins. We didn't have that luxury. And these are our homelands. We don't come from anywhere else but, what people now know as Canada or Alberta. These are the homelands where we come from as First Nations people. My stepdad, who was white, I got to learn about the British and the French culture through him. My dad, who's Métis, and my mom is First Nations. So I, at a very young age, became sort of a culture shifter, a code shifter, if you will, in learning how to act in each of these settings and seeing the difference. It was also at this time where I saw the lived realities and I started to ask the critical questions, like why was my stepdad's family so, the groceries, even the groceries itself in the fridge, were so very different than my First Nations family on the reserve, right, as a young kid. And so I started asking, why are my cousins being arrested? Why is there sex work in part of my family? Why are there addictions? Why did my uncle shoot himself at 17 in the head? Why? So very young, I started asking these critical questions. And over time in my anti-racist work, started to look at, colonialism, genocide, all of the things that impact a people. And so now, since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, all Canadians are starting to grapple and understand the reality that First Nations have had to live through. And the legacy of the Indian residential school. My great-grandparents were the first generation to be taken from my First Nation, and they were shipped off to Dunbow. So by horse and buggy, they were taken to High River from Calahoo, which would have probably taken a couple days to get there. So, who's going to run away to home? You can't possibly run away back home. And they would be gone all year in the industrial school, and they would come home once a year at Christmas time. Then the next generation were my grandparents and all of their siblings, and they attended the Youville Indian Residential School, which was in St. Albert. And, these schools were horrific. Dr. Ian Mosby, he's a nutritionist, and he was just looking through archives, looking at historical documents around nutrition. And then he started to see a theme, and he eventually did a bunch of papers and a book around the starvation and the malnutrition and the experiments that were done, not just in Indian residential schools, but in all of the Indian residential schools across Canada. And so what these experiments were about, for example, particular vitamins that you and I take for granted and might take to nourish our bodies now, were actually experimented on in children, and they had to be malnourished and starved in order to get the outcomes that the scientists wanted. And so all of this is documented. All of this is research. And so now our work is about, okay, what are the physiological damages around the brain and the body to a human being with these experiments over generations, and how do we repair and recover so that we are fully thriving, healthy families? And so we look at the discourse of diabetes throughout our families. We have the highest rate in Canada. We have the highest rate of sexually transmitted diseases, of HIV, and HIV is on the rise in First Nations. So these are some of the questions that we have to find solutions for. Why is it this way, and what are we going to do to fix it? If we look at the legacy of the Indian residential schools, you know, my grandparents, when they attended, they weren't taught to love. In fact, they weren't allowed to speak to their siblings in the Indian residential school. So when my great aunt at 18 left and my grandfather at 16, they finally could have a relationship with each other. And how awkward to get to know your sibling as an adult and to not know them throughout your entire childhood. So the fractured family identity is huge. And so then you have babies and you've never learned nurturing, kindness, love. In fact, you were raped, sodomized, abused, neglected, beat, and, you know, nutrition. And you are often using drugs and alcohol to numb your trauma. And then you have children. Well, you have no coping skills and you have no parenting skills, not to any fault of your own, because you've experienced nothing but horrors. So, and it's just not a school, a family. It's the majority of, Alberta had the highest number of Indian residential schools, which means we have the highest number of Indian residential school survivors, intergenerational survivors, you know, and it takes generations to break the cycles of trauma and abuse and harm and neglect. You know, if we look at Dr. Gabor Mate's work and Dr. Bruce Perry's work on, you know, sort of what trauma does to the brain in itself when it's developing. You know, my Nookum was 3 years old when she was taken. At 3, she was taken from her mom and dad and placed in that school until she was 18. So there was no nurturing, there was no love, and the brain itself doesn't develop. So your coping skills, your ability to problem solve, you know, to live in life, to cook, simple things people often take for granted. Where do you learn to cook if no one's ever taught you? Right. So you know, when I was working in the school on the reservation, so we're seeing the intergenerational trauma, you know, coming in the children and the grandchildren and the children, like the generations. And over time, we're healing, we're repairing, we're recovering. But you know, we've got generations of work to still go. And it's really about the love and the nurturing, learning to love ourselves when really we were demonized. And so we were taught, you know, my grandfather had a needle in his tongue when he spoke his language.